1 minute.
Chikezi, all yours. We are ready.
Cool. Okay. Good evening, good afternoon, colleagues from any part of the world you're joining. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this edition of Human African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series. My name is Chikezi Uzebunam. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at HUMA, which stands for Institute for Humanities in Africa. Now, about HUMA. HUMA is a research institute, a research intensive institute located in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Cape Town. And our work takes a broad view of the humanities, and it is a hub of innovative research that opens up new areas of interdisciplinary inquiry and also establishes strong connections between scholars, because human relationship is very important for us at HUMA. And really, HUMA has an Afropolitan outlook. And what a fitting seminar that we're having today that is on Afropolitanism. And the Human African Epistemologies Advanced Seminar Series seeks to showcase, first of all, it is one of the many seminar series that we host at HUMA, but this one specifically seeks to showcase African knowledge systems and traditions. And here, African and Africanist philosophers are prominently featured. But on the whole, the series encompasses an interdisciplinary orientation. And the central themes that we deal with in this series are African philosophy, but also we invite speakers to reflect on the questions of African feminisms, Pan-Africanism, race, interculturality, and so on and so forth. And under this series, we invite established African and Africanist scholars and researchers who have made sterling important contributions to the cause of African scholarship. And today we are joined by one of such African and Africanist scholars who is very distinguished and who is going to speak to us shortly. Let me now take the pleasure to introduce Professor Adekeye Adebajo, who is our special guest in today's seminar series. Professor Adekeye Adebajo is the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, IPATC, at the University of Johannesburg. He's the author of 7 books, including Building Peace in West Africa, The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War, Thabo Mbeki, Africa's Philosopher King, and The Trial of Cecil John Rhodes. Professor Adebajo is the co-editor and editor of 10 books on Africa's international relations, including the EU and Africa, the Pan-African Pantheon, and Africa's Peacemakers. Professor Adebajo holds a doctorate from Oxford University in the United Kingdom, and he's a columnist for Business Day in South Africa, The Guardian in Nigeria, and The Gleaner in Jamaica. Today, he'll be speaking to us on the powerful title, Pan-Africanism, From Slavery to Reparations. Please, before I cue in Professor Adebajo, can we please alert our distinguished guests to please mute their audios so that there will be no interruptions as the presentation is going on. Also, please feel free to drop your questions and your reflections as the presentation is going on, and you will be given an opportunity to ask if you wish to ask by yourself, or we can pick it up from the chat. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, I present to you Professor Adekeye Adebajo. You're welcome, Prof. The floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to just thank the director, Divine Fu, and Dr. Sonia Osha, who invited me for the talk. And it's great to see such a distinguished group of people. I want to talk just for 25 minutes so that we can have at least half an hour for discussion, and hopefully it will be lively discussion. This lecture, based on my introduction in a recently published 38-chapter book that I edited on the Pan-African pantheon, prophets, poets, and philosophers, involved 37 African, Afro-Caribbean, and African-American scholars. And the book sought to make a substantive contribution to contemporary debates in an era of both Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall. And I want to pay tribute to the UCT students who lit the fuse in 2015 for the global Rhodes Must Fall movement, which has been significant in debates about transforming curricula. The Pan-African Pantheon book also aims to contribute to transforming fossilized Eurocentric curricula, which have insisted for centuries that dead white men continue to occupy the central position in global epistemologies on almost every subject under the sun. And I believe this is part of what the Humor series is trying to address. After briefly defining Pan-Africanism, the talk examines the impact of and resistance to the European slavery of Africa. I then examine how Europe systematically underdeveloped Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America through centuries of colonial rule. We then assess calls for reparations to be provided as restitution for the 4.5 centuries of slavery and colonialism. The lecture ends with some brief reflections on how to build a new civil society-led Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism then can be defined as the efforts to promote the political, socio-economic, and cultural unity, emancipation, and self-reliance of Africa and its diaspora. The ideology argues that Africans on the continent and around the globe share a common history. Pan-Africanists in the Caribbean and the Americas felt physically dispossessed by slavery, while Pan-Africanists on the continent felt economically and mentally dislocated through colonialism. Both were therefore seeking to affirm their worth and dignity in a world of racism. Blacks in the diaspora also deeply internalized a racism born of 4.5 centuries of slavery and suffered from a profound sense of low self-esteem. The concept of Pan-Africanism thus developed amidst the sweltering oppression of slavery in the Caribbean and the Americas and was transported back to Africa by its students, people like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, Nigeria's Nnamdi Azikiwe, Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, who all studied in the West. Slavery was undoubtedly Europe's original sin against Africa. European locusts, explorers, slavers, merchants, missionaries, imperialists arrived in Africa in the 15th century and for the next 4.5 centuries, basically ravaged and pillaged the continent. In the process, they spread destructive plague and pestilence. As with biblical locusts, the agricultural sector in which most Africans found themselves was destroyed. Famines proliferated, and the greatest migration in human history was enforced, with enchained human chattel being transported to the Caribbean and the Americas in utterly degrading circumstances. Colonialism was the continuation of slavery by other means, with enslavement dehumanizing Africans globally and providing the racist justifications and economic methods to implement colonialism on the basis that Africans could not yet stand on their own feet in the difficult conditions of Western civilizations, as was said at the time. European enslavement of Africans to work on plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas thus created one of the world's largest diasporas and flowed seamlessly into a century of European imperialism of Africa. Both systems involve profit-driven exploitation, cloaked under the perverse justification of a mission civilisatrice, which blamed their African victims for their own misfortunes, while the whole project was legitimized by Western politicians and priests, merchants and monarchs, as well as scientists and scholars. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported to the Caribbean and and the Americas between 1450 and 1888 in the notorious transatlantic slave trade. The slavers were mostly from 7 nations: Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark. By the 17th century, slaves were being exported to work on sugar plantations in Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, Trinidad, Martinique, and Barbados, as well as Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. The US, which had also been born out of the European genocide of the indigenous populations, was deeply involved in the trade, having inherited sugar, tobacco, and rice-growing slave plantations from British overlords in 1776. African slaves thus worked on cotton plantations in the South to feed British textiles, becoming the heart of the American economy. Those enslaved populations came mostly from contemporary Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, the Congos, Cameroon, Gabon, Angola, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. Captives were usually kidnapped in wars between African kingdoms and principalities, while some had been convicted of often dubious domestic crimes. About 80% of the enslaved were exported to the Americas in the 18th and early 19th century, and about a quarter of them actually died en route. They never made it to the Americas. Millions of the most productive African men and women, typically between the ages of 15 and 35, were thus enslaved in their prime, and an entire continent was depopulated. Famines increased in some areas as slave hunters and warriors were prioritized over farmers and entrepreneurs. Slavery effectively arrested human growth, socioeconomic development, and intra-regional trade across Africa. This inhuman commerce provided the capital for Europe's and America's industrial revolution. So the West's industrialization was effectively and literally built on the back of African slaves. There were numerous slave revolts, though, in the Caribbean and the Americas. So there was resistance to slavery, which is a very important part of the story that isn't always told. And notably, in Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil, and the US, you had slave revolts, over 400 slave revolts in Jamaica alone. There were many cases also of African resistance to European colonialism, such as the 17th century Queen Njinga's Ndongo Kingdom in contemporary Angola, which managed to hold off the Portuguese during her 3-decade rule. Civil society-led Pan-Africanist movements also emerged in the US and the Caribbean by the 18th century to provide African resistance to slavery and promote liberation of the motherland. Black churches, such as America's African Methodist Episcopal Church and Jamaica's Ethiopian Baptist Church, played a particularly prominent role in leading this resistance. The Haitian Revolution of 1804 was the first successful slave revolt and the only one that created the first Black republic in the hemisphere and only the second independent country in the hemisphere, as memorialized in C.L.R. James's 1938 classic, The Black Jacobins. On the cultural front, Haitians, Afro-Brazilians, and Afro-Cubans also preserved indigenous African religions, which were often fused syncretically with Catholicism. Negro spirituals were characteristic, especially of slaves in the American South, as eloquently captured in W.E.B. Du Bois' 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. Blues and jazz both emerged directly from slavery, based on the rhythmic West African traditional work songs that the slaves sang on southern plantations. The improvisational nature of jazz is also tied to the same slave culture. And it's no exaggeration to say that the whole of American popular music, from jazz to Motown to rap to hip hop, had its roots in this historical slave tradition. It's also no surprise that some of the saddest people in the world invented the singing of blues, underlining African American writer Maya Angelou's observation of why the caged bird sings. The link between slavery and colonialism is inextricable. Scholars like Guyana's Walter Rodney, in his 1972 classic, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, have shown how European powers created economic dependence of the periphery in order to perfect the system of colonial rule in the Caribbean and the Americas during 2 centuries of slavery before formally applying it to Africa for a century. Africa, of course, was notoriously declared a res nullius, in no man's land, and conquered by psychopathic European imperialists like England's Cecil Rhodes and Belgium's King Leopold II. The British explorer David Livingstone talked of the 3 C's in describing colonialism in apparently benign terms of Christianity, commerce, and civilization. But we think that the 3 P's was probably more accurate in describing it. Profit, plunder, and prestige was really what it was about. The search for new markets amidst a global Great Depression in the early 1880s was a widespread concern that spurred on European imperialism in Africa. Scientific techniques were introduced into colonial territories that led to the production of minerals and crops, cocoa, coffee, diamonds, tobacco, etc. As African economies were thus structured, as the economies of the Caribbean and Americas had been for 2 centuries, to produce crops to meet European consumer needs. This both increased their dependence on metropolitan economies and in many cases negatively impacted on their own ability to produce their own food. So Africans, Caribbeans, and Latin Americans typically imbibed Western consumption patterns without necessarily acquiring the production techniques. 19th century scholar diplomat St. Thomas's Edward Blyden is widely regarded as the father of Pan-Africanism and the most prominent conceptualizer of the ideology. His 2 most important ideas were a triple African heritage of Christianity, Islam, and indigenous cultures as captured in his magisterial 1888 study, and of an African personality through which Africans would make their unique contribution to world cultures and rediscover their own souls by returning to their indigenous cultural values. Blyden also championed the idea of Ethiopianism, talking about an African Renaissance over a century before Thabo Mbeki and Pixley Seme and others, and the return of African Americans to Africa to help develop the ancestral continent. The Pan-Africanist movement was formally born in 1900 when Henry Sylvester Williams, the Trinidadian lawyer, organized a conference in London. 15 years later, Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey were basically mobilizing large crowds from New York's Harlem to all across the US in the Back to Africa movement. And then 5 Pan-Africanist congresses were organized between 1919 and 1945 in European and American cities. And by the time of the 5th Manchester Congress in 1945, organized by Kwame Nkrumah and the towering scholar activist George Padmore from Trinidad, Pan-Africanism had basically been handed over from the diaspora to Africa. And most of the participants there were African politicians, future politicians that were going to lead their countries, and trade unionists and other civil society groups as well. Economic development and regional integration proved difficult to achieve in the Caribbean as it had been in Africa after independence from the 1960s, owing to the insularity within these small monocrop economies, which were producing mostly bauxite, sugar, and agricultural goods. These were tourist-dependent islands that have consistently asserted parochial national identities over regional ones. As in Africa, with its 16 landlocked microstates, the Caribbean states, with a total population of only 20 million, will inevitably have to cooperate more closely in order to attain the economies of scale to be able to industrialize. In light of the contemporary global anti-slavery and anti-colonial protests led by the Black Lives Matter movement, a burning issue that has not been adequately addressed is that of reparations for the victims of these two evil scourges in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. How can Western nations who enslaved and colonized Black people for nearly 5 centuries repair the pernicious damage that has left all three regions struggling with the triple burdens of debt, diseases, and deadly conflicts? This remains a festering wound that needs to be healed. As the 400th anniversary of American slavery was commemorated in 2019, calls for reparations for descendants of this exploitative system grew louder. Democrats in the US Congress have now embraced the reparations cause. Institutions like Harvard, Brown, and Yale that benefited from slavery are also putting in place systems of restitution. Similar campaigns also exist in Africa and the Caribbean. Rather perversely, it was the slave owners, rather than the slaves or their descendants, that were actually compensated by the American and British governments. So Britain paid a contemporary equivalent of 20 billion British pounds to the people, the slaveholders, to give up their so-called property in 1833 when slavery was abolished across the British Empire. The most articulate African-American crusader of reparations has been the civil rights activist Randall Robinson. He consistently argued for reparations to close the 246-year gap between white and Black Americans created by plantation slavery. Late African-American Nobel laureate Toni Morrison persistently talked of, and I quote, the layers of scar tissue that the Black body has grown in order to obscure, if not annihilate, the slave body underneath. As Robinson correctly noted, the Black Holocaust is far and away the most heinous human rights crime visited upon any group of people in the world over the last 500 years. He noted that Germany paid Jewish survivors and the State of Israel reparations, recently estimated at $98 billion for the much shorter Holocaust, while Japanese Americans who had been interned by Franklin Roosevelt's government during the Second World War were also compensated with $1.2 million. Robinson further observed that indigenous populations received land and money from the Australian colonial government's genocidal campaign against them, as did members of Canada's Inuit group, $700 million. To understand the continuing structural impact of slavery in the US, we don't have to go very far. During the recent COVID-19 Great Plague of 2020 to 2021, despite accounting for 13.8% of the US population, Black Americans were being hospitalized at rates 2.9 times that of their white compatriots and dying at 1.9 times faster a rate than whites. In the Caribbean, Barbadian historian and chair of the Caribbean Communities Reparations Commission, Hilary Beckles, similarly noted that, and I quote, slavery and genocide in the Caribbean are lived experiences despite over a century of emancipation. So modern ailments common among Caribbeans, like diabetes and hypertension, can be traced directly to the bad diet and sugary drinks inherited from the era of European slavery and colonialism. A 2004 estimate of the cost of the slave trade to the Caribbean put it at 7.5 trillion pounds. Beckles therefore urged European slaving nations to pay reparations to Caribbean countries in order to repair this damage. This has started happening to some extent, but not to these levels. In August 2019, Scotland's Glasgow University agreed to raise £20 million to establish a joint centre for development research at the University of the West Indies to atone for the misdeeds of Scottish slave traders. In Oxford University, All Souls College also announced an annual scholarships for Caribbean students, as well as give 100,000 grant to Codrington College in Barbados for having received funding from the 18th century slave trader, Christopher Codrington, after whom the main college library was named until as recently as November 2020. In the African context, late Nigerian historian Adekeye was a member of the Organization of African Unity's Eminent Persons Group on reparations in 92 to 93, which demanded that the West recognize its moral debt to Africa. Ajayi also noted that 1 million Africans had died in the two world wars trying to protect their colonial masters. He called for 4 measures in order to achieve reparations. 1, domestic education and mobilization in African societies. 2, documenting and researching the cost of slavery and colonialism. 3, making a cogent case for reparations. And 4, agreeing on a strategy, manner, and mode of reparations, having placed the issue before the UN. It's now time to conclude this journey, which is both a lamentation and a celebration of Africa Day. It has stretched from Accra to Atlanta to Antigua and Arequipa. It is important to note that the Pan-African solidarity forged in the crucible of 5 centuries of slavery, colonialism, and the decolonization and anti-apartheid struggles has now dissipated. Pan-Africanism is thus in urgent need of revival. The ideology will need to build a new civil society-led movement that builds and strengthens the bridges between Africa and its diaspora to go beyond the sterile Pan-Africanism of governments to a reinvigorated Pan-Africanism of peoples. It is crucial that some flesh be added to the skeletal bones of the diaspora as the 6th African Union sub-region, so that these stronger bridges can be built. Entrepreneurial members of the African American community already invest heavily in countries like South Africa and Liberia, while Africans in the diaspora now contribute more money in remittances than do foreign donors. The millions of highly educated Africans in the diaspora can further be mobilized to build a viable constituency for Africa in their host countries. The Africa-born population in the US astonishingly doubled every decade between 1970 and 2020 to reach 2.4 million. Most of them are Nigerians, Ethiopians, and Ghanaians. In the Caribbean, identification with Africa has grown tremendously as a result of Nollywood movies, which has led to populations experiencing cultures and people with which they can readily identify. But the level of social interaction and trade is abysmally low between Africa and the Caribbean, despite sporadic intergovernmental summits. And part of the problem is also that most young people in the Caribbean desire to study in the US. So the cultural pull of America is still a much stronger attraction, especially for the youth of the region. Having united to attain the political kingdom from the 1960s, Africa and its neglected diaspora in the Caribbean and the Americas must now collaborate to reach the socio-economic and cultural kingdoms. You'll remember that Nkrumah famously called in the 50s for Africa to seek first the political kingdom and all other things would be added onto it. Well, not everything was added onto it, and we now need to build a new people-driven Pan-Africanism from Benin to Bahia through Baltimore and Bridgetown. God bless Africa. Amen.
God bless Africa indeed. Amen. Thank you so much, Professor Adebajo. Thank you so much for this generous presentation, and it is very fitting for our celebration of Africa Day, and it is really insightful how you reminded us, a critical reminder of the European, what you call the twin European plagues of slavery and colonialism, the trajectory, and of how the Pan-African movement began to resist and to challenge this, and also bringing it back home or closer to consciousness is the African-centered movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, which you acknowledged in the beginning of your presentation, and American-centered ones like Black Lives Matter. These are some of the movements that have become global and taken a life of their own. But which in your presentation, you really remind us that they are Pan-Africanist in nature, and they should always remind us of the need that more is needed to improve our Pan-Africanism. So thank you so much for the recommendations also with regards to restitution and reparations. And I see there are lots of questions already popping in, and we're going to open the floor now for Q&A. And I want to welcome our distinguished guests once more, for those who joined us late. This is still the advanced seminar series that is called African Epistemology Seminar Series, organized by HUMA, Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And we are now going to take questions for Professor Adekeye. Please, if you want to ask your question personally, please indicate by a raise of hand or use the emoticon to indicate, and then I will pick you up. I'll try as much as possible to pick you up, or my co-host can also help me to pick that up. But the first question is, that I can see from the chat, is the first question is from Sajis. So Sajis, please, could you reframe your question to be clearer, or we can give you opportunity to ask personally. Let me give our Dean the first opportunity to ask questions. We acknowledge the presence of the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Professor Shosekesi, has raised her hand to ask the question. Thank you, Dean, and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chikezi. I wasn't planning to cut the queue, but welcome, Prof. Ade. It's nice to see you. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask about in your chapter, you also claim that Pan-Africanism has failed, and I wanted to ask, what do you think of the value of Pan-Africanism now? Is it sufficient for us to mobilize around a history of dispossession and dislocation of by slavery and colonization, and just in the context of the kind of levels of violence internally of Africans towards other Africans, levels of gender-based violence, issues of gender diversity, sexual diversity. I just wanted to know, what is your view on whether this idea of Pan-Africanism in this context is still valid today? Thanks.
I'm presuming you're going to take a few questions and then let me answer them.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me read out another question. I don't know how many you want to take at a time, Prof.
Maybe 4 or 5, perhaps.
Oh, okay. Let me read the question from the chat, one of the first. This is from Athol Williams. He's asking, he or she or they are asking, how do we determine the quantum of reparations owed to Africa, whether financial or otherwise? How do we determine the quantum of reparations owed to Africa, whether financial or otherwise? There's another question by Rocio Vera. They're asking, could you please recommend literature about reparation in the context of Latin America and Caribbean? There's a question. Is this a question? Okay, I'm going to move to Thozama. Financial compensation as reparations is helpful in the short term, but not transformative. Financial compensation as reparations is helpful in the short term, but not transformative. What do reparations that are broad-based, victim-centric, and multifaceted look like? What do reparations that are broad-based, victim-centric, and multifaceted look like? I think you can take these ones now, Prof. In the meantime, then we'll give opportunity for those raising their hand.
Okay, can we more get people involved that are in the audience rather than just reading out questions, which could send people to sleep? It would be great if we could have it more interactive than just reading out questions. But let me
there
try
are some people.
I know, but I think we should try, if we can, to have both so that it's interactive. It's just a bit boring with people droning on, reading out things. But let me try to answer, Chair, and you're doing very well. So thanks. I think in terms of reparations, the examples that I've given of Glasgow University, Harvard University, Yale, and even Oxford University shows that it doesn't necessarily need to be in monetary terms. Reparations can also be supporting Caribbean students, for example, who are descendants of slaves, or supporting African-American students, likewise. It can be, for example, what Glasgow is doing, collaborating with the University of the West Indies and setting up a collaborative research center that can do joint work. European governments, the 7 that I mentioned, especially who were involved in the slave trade for, at least 3 or 4 centuries, they are the ones that can provide infrastructure, development assistance, annulment of debts, educational support. All those kinds of things can be done, and it can be structured in many ways. So there isn't one way of doing reparations. I mean, and there are different ways of also calculating the cost. The important thing is that there's an acknowledgement of guilt. There's an acknowledgement of suffering that caused damage, structural damage, economically, politically, culturally, and that damage needs to be repaired. And that's the main argument I think we should make. And we can always work out what ways of compensation can be found. But I don't think we should get caught up with what are the exact figures of the reparations. In terms of the literature on Latin America and Caribbean reparations there, I'd mentioned Hilary Beckles in the Caribbean context as someone who has done a lot of work on reparations. There's also a scholar called Sandra Souza who has done a lot of work in Latin America on reparations. And we're actually at the moment producing a 30-chapter edited book on slavery, colonialism, and reparations. And so if the person asking the question wants to go deeper, I can put them in touch with some of these authors so that they might be able to consult that literature. Someone asked in the chat here, I'm not sure whether you saw it, that which God am I talking about when I said God bless Africa? And I found it quite a fascinating comment. Of course, the two big religions of Christianity and Islam that came into Africa introduced the idea of the monotheistic God. Africa had always been a lot more diverse in terms of its own gods. So I think that's something that we can debate and look at. But I happen to be descended from the Christian God that was handed to us. And then Chose Kessie, Professor Kessie, noted that I had said that Pan-Africanism failed, but I think you may be mixing up my chapter with that of Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies. He wrote a chapter in the book called The Great Durban Betrayal, Global Africa Reparations and the End of Pan-Africanism. And he was particularly piqued that in 2001, during the UN World Conference Against Racism, the African heads of states, according to him, had basically betrayed the Caribbean and American diaspora by not pushing hard enough for reparations for slavery from the delegates that were based there. And so I think that was his basis for the failure of Pan-Africanism. But on the other, my own personal position, if you read my chapter carefully, is actually that Pan-Africanism succeeded amidst very powerful odds. You know, the imperial powers were incredibly powerful compared to these church movements in the Caribbean and the Americas, and also even the liberation movements that popped up in the Caribbean and Africa by the 1950s. But against all odds, this ideology was actually able to achieve the liberation of Africa and the Caribbean. So I don't describe Pan-Africanism in any way as a failure in my chapter. I agree with you that Pan-Africanism needs to be updated, which was the point I was making at the end of my lecture. And I think all of these issues that you talk about, gender-based violence, accepting sexual diversity, etc., are issues that a new Pan-Africanism would have to embrace and grapple with. But I absolutely agree with that it needs to be diversified. But my view is that Pan-Africanism actually succeeded spectacularly and can be revived to play a role in some of the current crises that we're going through. So, Chair, I hope I've been able to cover at least most of the questions.
Yes, Prof. You've covered them. We have 3 hands that are up. Sajis want to ask his question personally now. Then after that, we'll take Raf and then Sakiru. Sajis, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm calling from Côte d'Ivoire. My English is not that so perfect. Thank you for the expose. And you said that slavery and colonialism has done very bad to Africa. And then we can say that those events have destroyed Africa. But what surprises me is the incapacity of Africans to resist as people. When you look in the world, other people, as people, they used to resist. But when it comes to Black African people, we do not have the sense of community of people. You know, to destroy Côte d'Ivoire, the army came from Burkina Faso. To destroy Libya, Benghazi people were involved. Always African people are ready to join the enemy to destroy Africa. So I think fundamentally we are having a problem with our mindset. I don't know whether in your research you go deep into that to find out how is our mindset as people, so that there is always some people who are ready to join the enemy for the doom of Africa. So is there is some problem there? I want to understand. I don't know whether you have done any study in this direction. My second, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Okay.
you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. My second question is about reparation. Reparation is okay. But when you look at Africa right now, people used to say African solidarity, you know. But what I observe in the field, we are selfish. We are selfish. Even if you talk about reparation right now, and the money is sent to Africa, there will be always some group people who just, you know, collect the money and chop it and do whatever they want to eat. And they don't care for the people. So definitely, I think if we want to update Pan-Africanism, we have to build the new coming Pan-Africanism in values, voilà, values, human values. For the moment, I think I will say something you may not like it. We are underrate humanity as people. That's my contribution to the debate. So our mindset, can you settle it? How can you evaluate our mindset as people? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Raf, go ahead. After Raf, then we'll take Sakiru. Then we will take some questions that came before in the chat. Then we will go back to personal questions. Then we will take Babaka and Sam. Raf.
Thank you, Chikezi, and thank you, Adekeye, for your talk. I'm a researcher at HUMA, and I work as an artist. And I have an ongoing art project that's about the legacy of Marcus Garvey, and it takes place in the centenary year of the centenary period of the Black Star Line, which is 2019 to 2022. And I'm taking this project to Senegal next year for the Dakar Biennale. I'm really interested in how Marcus Garvey's work from a century ago seemed so ahead of its time in the way that he used techniques like crowdfunding and getting his issues into the media. And he sent delegations to the League of Nations in Geneva, and he talked to the early Irish Republicans. So there was this real global sense of activism that really got into the public eye from 100 years ago. And it's interesting to see how much things are different and how much things are the same now, a century later. I think the Black Star Line could be seen as almost an example of heroic failure, talking back to the discussion earlier about whether Pan-Africanism failed or not. And I think the idea of heroic failure is what is achieved through something in the long term, even if in the immediate term it fails. So the Black Star Line never reached Africa, but the legacy of the Black Star Line still continues to this day. And you can see the Black Star and the flag of Ghana and so on. So yeah, I think that's a sort of a grounding of my relationship to Pan-Africanism through art and Marcus Garvey. I'm really interested to look more recently in history at the reparations campaign from South Africa in the Jubilee campaign that started in the late 90s. So Jubilee South Africa was asking for the cancellation of apartheid debt. And I think something significant about it was that the South African government didn't support the Jubilee campaign. So the South African government the new African National Congress government was landed with paying back debts that had been accrued by the apartheid government. And instead of being able to use that money on their own rehabilitation of South Africa, they had to pay it back to international banks and lenders. So I'd be interested in hearing any comment on the Jubilee campaign and South Africa's own one, and there's an international Jubilee campaign as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raf. Sakiru, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Please permit me to put off my video because of network. Thank you so much, Prof, for this very stimulating presentation. And what I really appreciate from your talk is the way you've been able to connect the Black Atlantic and also the presence of Africa in this history, because most of the time when people talk about slavery reparations, be it Gilroy or even Du Bois, there's always that, lack or absence of Africa in the conversation. And so my question is, speaking of reparations and, taking historical responsibilities for slavery, how do we factor in African slave traders, or in your presentation, you called them slave hunters? For instance, the Nigerian writer Adaobi Nwabani wrote for the BBC how her grandfather was a slave trader, and how there is some sort of like inheritance of wealth, in the family, even in West Africa. So how when we speak about reparations of slavery, how do we also factor in the complicit African slave traders? In fact, we could also speak of the colonial Blacks when we talk about reparations for colonialism too. And the second question is still on the issue of Pan-Africanism. And I want to go back to the first question about the usefulness of Pan-Africanism. And you did mention that, Pan-Africanism can still be updated. But I mean, thinking about, the rise of ultra-nationalism and, xenophobic nationalism, and also just thinking that, Pan-Africanism also had some sort of nationalistic underpinnings in its history, and also how, after African countries began to gain independence, there was, some sort of silence in that politics. So I'm thinking maybe we probably just need a new vocabulary, because as long as we are still working within the framework, the nationalistic framework, then Pan-Africanism would always, the ideology, the underpinning ideology would always shoot itself in the foot. So I'm just wondering, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Rob, do you want to take this range of questions before we continue with others?
Yes, I think it's a good idea, because it's a lot of questions. I shouldn't get what I asked for, So thank you very much. Really insightful comments. I think you have a great and very intelligent audience. I think, first of all, in terms of my Ivorian colleague, I think he was a bit too harsh on Africans, and it's important that we put things in historical context. That's why I went back 500 years to try to explain some of the structural issues. We mustn't look too much from where we stand now, from the present, as if there hasn't been a history that has contributed to where we find ourselves structurally. Every country and every continent has that historical and structural explanation. And I think we need to look at that more dispassionately. What I would say is that there was resistance by Africans to colonialism, and that resistance I try to outline. For example, the female monarch that I talked about in Dongo in contemporary Angola. These were people that consciously set out to make strategic alliances and to combat colonialists. There were all other monarchs in places like Dahomey who did the same thing. You'll find that kind of resistance among the Maroons in Jamaica that fought the British to a standstill, even forced them to sue for peace and to sign an agreement with them in the 17th century. And I talked about all of the slave revolts as well, 40 in Jamaica alone. So that resistance was definitely there, and I don't think we should underestimate it. And we shouldn't also underestimate the disparities in power, because don't forget that colonialism was also built at a time when Europe was industrializing and the means of destruction was getting more and more sophisticated. And for me, the fact that we even survived as a people is a miracle in itself, because don't forget that some peoples were actually nearly wiped out. If you look at indigenous peoples in Australia and in the Americas, the Europeans nearly succeeded in wiping them out. So the fact that we've succeeded and that we're still standing is an achievement in and of itself, given how much decimation took place, you know, that many of your most able people, your most productive people were taken out of the continent, and the continent itself could not benefit from them. And some of these were quite skilled people in terms of ironsmiths and goldsmiths and things like that. So I think it's important to take a step back and just look at that. Corruption also is not specific to Africa. Corruption is everywhere. Corruption is part of human nature, even in the most sophisticated Western economies, you will find corruption. I think the difference in Asia, in Latin America, everywhere there's corruption. As long as you have human beings, you will see corruption. I think the key difference is that some of these systems have been able to build institutions to be able to regulate and control corrupt behavior. We haven't been able to do that yet, and that should be a priority for all of us, to be able to hold these rascals responsible. You know, legislators in Nigeria are paying themselves more than almost any legislators anywhere in the world. How do you hold people like that accountable so that they realize that they're actually accountable to the people and not just responsible for passing huge perks and allowances for themselves? They must make legislation that makes sense within their own context. And that's something we need to work harder on. But strengthening civil society is also an important part of that, and making sure that the checks and balances that are there to check executive and legislative powers are strengthened as well. So that's kind of like my short answer. And you know, there is nothing wrong with the mindset of Africans. You know, you have some of the most brilliant Africans that have excelled in every single field of endeavor, whether it's literature, your Wole Soyinkas and Toni Morrisons, or your Nadine Gordimers, or in science, you know, the Nigerians that have worked at the top levels of NASA, in every field that you can think of, or Egyptian scientists and biologists that have won, chemists that have won Nobel laureates in chemistry. You have brilliant Africans in all fields of endeavor. What we suffer from is poor leadership. And that's what we've been struggling for 6 decades to try to overcome. Have better leadership and strong institutions. And it's a process, not an event. I was fascinated by the artists working on Marcus Garvey and also the insights, and I hope the exhibition will also be in South Africa as well. Garvey was ahead of his time. What I liked about our book, and I haven't actually shown it, if you don't mind, Shea, I'll just abuse this is the book, The Pan-African Pantheon. The one thing I like about this book is that it didn't just focus on Marcus Garvey, but also focused on Amy Ashwood Garvey, his wife. And she was absolutely instrumental in many of the organizational work and editing and writing journals and disseminating the information that happened during this time. Garvey also, of course, controversially collaborated with not just those groups you talked about, but also the Ku Klux Klan, because to some extent, they both had separatist ideologies. So that was a controversial part of Marcus Garvey as well. But I agree with you, the Black Star Alliance was a heroic failure. He had vision, but he didn't, unfortunately, have the management skills or honest people to be able to achieve taking all of these African Americans back to develop Africa. And it was tragic, not only that the Black Star did not make it to Africa, but that Marcus Garvey himself never made it to Africa. And then the last question I want to note is, you talked about Jubilee and the canceling the apartheid debt. South African government has done some quite controversial things. For example, Thabo Mbeki, when he was president between 1998 and 2008, opposed efforts to launch class action suits against American companies that had benefited from apartheid. So that was going to happen in US courts and basically punish companies that had worked in apartheid and benefited from Black slave labor effectively. And that was opposed by the South African government as well. But a general comment on these debts is that these debts must be cancelled. Africa has debts of over $400 billion. Much of these debts have been paid back in terms of interest payments, and it is absolutely grotesque and morally reprehensible and unacceptable that African countries, many of them, are spending the equivalent of 30 to 40% of their education and health budgets just servicing the interest on debts that everybody knows will not be paid back in full. So these debts do need to be cancelled. They're morally repugnant.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have run out of time. It's actually 5 o'clock now, but Prof and the audience, I don't know if we can go over a few minutes, maybe in the spirit of Africa Day celebration. Prof, I don't know if you can take any more questions. We're supposed to end this seminar at 5, but there are still some questions in the chat and two hands that are raised.
Prof is muted.
Prof, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm happy to take another round of questions, the last round of questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your generosity. Let me read the question by Rocio. They would like to know if there is any information about kings, queens, or important people who have been transported to Latin America or the Caribbean as slaves. The next question in the chat is from Bongai. They're asking, how do reparations sit in the context of multiple layers of injustice on the continent, internal and external? How do reparations sit in the context of multiple layers of injustice on the continent, internal and external? And a question by Bok. What kind of relationships and alliances can be formed between the political descendants of enslaved African people and the descendants of indigenous people in other colonial landscapes, who were also subjected to genocides, enslavement, and other atrocities, and who continue to struggle? I think the last question here that I can see is, what is the root cause of African challenges? Because we think we are addressing challenges that we do not understand their roots, considering that all African records are distorted. I'll leave it there then, or maybe I can allow the people whose hands are raised to also ask theirs, so that maybe you can take everything, because this is the last batch of questions. If Sam could please ask this question. No, Babaka, sorry. Sorry, Babaka, is your turn to ask.
Thank you so much, Professor Adekeye, and thanks, Sikeze, for. I have just one comment and a question. More often than not, I think that in talking about African reparation, at least from Senegal, the way I understand it, sometimes we think that our humanity has to be measured vis-a-vis the West. Either we are Christians or we are Muslims, and this is linked to Frank Adoha's question, I think. So don't you think that there is a self-conformity, sustainable dynamic that comes in the fact of making possible that we also include in the discussion not only African Muslims, but African Christian, but also African who don't have the Christian or the Muslim faith? Because in Senegal, I mean, things are becoming very complex, you know. We tend to exclude those who who don't consider themselves as Muslim or Christian. Don't you think that it is also the fact of considering citizenship above Muslimhood or Christianity is also something that we have to consider if we want to have a kind of self-reflective, self-formative transformation. I don't know if you have any comment to make on that.
Sam, are you still here? Please, could you quickly ask your question?
Yes, I'm still here. It was more of a contribution, but I think since the time is up, I will just let the prof answer the questions and we'll just end it there.
And I also just want to comment and acknowledge that there are many more questions in the chat, but unfortunately, we may not be able to take them. Prof.
Okay, sorry, I dodged a very important question, not intentionally, in the last round. It was a really important question that was raised by one of the participants of the collaboration and involvement of Africans in the slave trade. It's true that African monarchs were involved in the slave trade, and this was often shameful. But my argument is that they were a very small cog in a European wheel, and it's mostly Europeans that initiated the system and benefited mostly from it. A lot of these African chiefs or kings actually got things like gunpowder, gin, kettles, useless things in exchange for the slaves that they were raiding and given to these slavers. So they weren't the main beneficiaries. And also, I think it's important to note that in some cases, they were actually terrorized by these slaving nations. You know, there were African monarchs that were killed and others that were threatened with being invaded or being overrun if they did not deliver the slaves. But I do agree with you that we need to include in this narrative the responsibility and participation of Africans in the slave trade. We can't get away from it, and we need to also talk about that. And there may be reparations needed also internally within those societies for that as well. But I don't think I want us to get away from the bigger picture as well. In terms of the other thing I just want to say also, though, is that the slave system in Africa, the internal one, which people also often choose to focus on, was very different because they weren't the property of the ethnic groups that had enslaved them, and there were systems of social mobility included in those internal systems. So I think it's important to note that. That was a very important question that I didn't answer. And in terms of, I think the same speaker also referred to the sterility of Pan-Africanism. And the point I was making at the end about moving it away from intergovernmentalism. So it's not the AU saying that there's a sixth region that is the diaspora, and then bringing Bob Marley's wife and some other people from the diaspora to Addis Ababa once a year. That's not quite going to cut it. So we need a more systematic and more increased interaction at an institutional level, but at the civil society, not the intergovernmental official level, because all of what I talked about from the 18th century was all civil society movement until Manchester. So that's what we need to try to revive. In terms of the more recent questions, let me just see if I can find my answers here. Yeah, in terms of where reparations sit within the multiple layers, etc., what I'm simply arguing is that reparations has never really been tackled as a serious issue. It's been done in an ad hoc way. The acknowledgement of the great structural damage that slavery and colonialism have had on Africa, on the Caribbean, on the Americas, has not always been adequate. And so we need a new movement that's going to adopt reparations as one of its major issues. And I think that with the Black Lives Matter, Rhodes Must Fall, those contemporary movements, we are pushing on an open door. And with high-level support in the US Congress, at least among Democrats and other powerful places, there is now an opportunity to try to make this one of the kind of major topics, a lightning rod for a new Pan-Africanism. That's what I'm mostly arguing. There's definitely scope to build alliances between indigenous people in the Americas, in Australia, and Africans. And I don't think enough of that is done, but I think that's a good observation. I don't know about literature, about monarchs being transported, you know, as slaves, but if the person that asked the question can send an email, I can try to put them in touch with some of our colleagues on the project I mentioned earlier. And then finally, I completely agree with the last comment of our Senegalese colleague. We can't just focus on Christianity or Islam because they're not indigenous to the continent. And that was my very point with Edward Blyden. His 1888 book was wanting to look at 3 different dimensions of Africa and add the indigenous aspect to it. Kwame Nkrumah also built on that with his idea of triple influences. But the most important initiative, I believe, in this area is the Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui's 1986 9-part series called The Africans, A Triple Heritage, which tried to synthesize the links between Christianity, Islam, and indigenous cultures. And it's still very much relevant today. So I would urge everybody who hasn't seen that to try to look at it. But thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Apparently, this is a very interesting discourse, and the questions have been flying in, and the discussions have been vibrant, and we thank everyone who have joined us for this edition. And we immensely thank Professor Adebajo, our guest, for his generosity and his time and his reflection. We hope that there will be more time in the future for us to engage with him. And also you can email him if you wish to continue some of these discussions, especially for some of the questions that were not taken. Our next edition of this series will be on 9th June, and the topic will be disabilities in an African cultural worldview. And it will be delivered by Edwin Etieyibo. Please look out for our announcements on our social media platforms, or follow or navigate to our website, the HUMA website, for a full calendar of our events this quarter. Thank you so much for joining us once again, and we hope you have a good evening.